The airport here in San Diego has a lactation room, and I didn't know what lactation meant when I went in the first time. I live in Houston, Texas, and about a month ago we had one of our very infrequent snowfalls. Spectacular. I enjoyed it. I made a snow angel. Yeah, I fell over backwards and couldn't get up. In about 3 weeks, I'm going to Europe to do some shows. Very excited about that. The first city will be Amsterdam, which I'm told has a lot of drugs, which I don't do, and a lot of sex workers. The airport.
Good morning. It's Monday, Cold War Monday, March the 23rd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Varney and Company, motivation, meditation, and the Cold War. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, Stuart Varney.
Morning, Maria, and well done indeed. Great interview right there. And good morning, everyone. Just 2 hours ago, President Trump put out a statement that created a very sharp reversal for the financial markets. He said he had directed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants for 5 days. He said there had been productive conversations about a complete resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East. We do not know who he'd been talking to. We do not know if that person or persons has the authority to make a deal. But President Trump telling Maria just moments ago, Iran wants to make a deal badly, within 5 days or even sooner. The markets love it. Before that Truth Social post appeared, stocks had been sharply lower. That reversed immediately. The Dow is now likely to gain up to 1,000 points at the opening bell. The S&P is up about 137. Look at that NASDAQ go 500 points higher. All those indicators up 2% or better. Show me big tech, please. It is a sea of green this morning. Microsoft up just $2. Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, they're all higher. Now, the key number. The price of oil, all the way down today to $88 a barrel. Now, before Truth Social posted, it was $99 a barrel. That was early this morning. Now it's $88.51. Interest rates, they're coming down. Another bullish indicator. The yield on the 10-year Treasury coming in at 4.36%. Before this, it was close to 4.5%. The 2-year, 3.875%, down a bit more. And that's plenty of green on the screen this Monday morning. That's in very sharp contrast to what we've been seeing recently. Well, there is other news. ICE agents will be helping out at TSA checkpoints at the airports today. The administration trying to do something about the long TSA lines. The Democrats do not like it. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said ICE agents might brutalize and kill people at the airport. That's inflammatory, isn't it? Late last night, an Air Canada jet hit a fire truck at LaGuardia. 2 pilots killed. The collision does not appear to be connected to any security issue, but LaGuardia is now closed. This will ripple through flight schedules throughout the day, worsening the TSA delays. Transportation Secretary Duffy, he's headed now to LaGuardia. There is no shortage of news in the Trump era, is there? It is Monday, March 23rd, 2026.
And that was Stuart Varney, nonprofit News Now. And again, he gets it wrong. He says the markets like that. No, the big banks like that. The big banks are the ones that move the markets. You and I don't. Back in a minute. The liberals confuse empathy with weakness, assuming that kindness means permission to manipulate or disregard boundaries. This distorted understanding of life leads to exploitation. The liberal takes and takes, rarely giving back in equal measure. They demand attention, praise, and sacrifice. But when the conservatives' needs arise, they are often ignored or dismissed. Endurance has its limits. Conservatives are not immune to pain. They can forgive, but forgiveness is not infinite. It is not a tool to enable destructive behavior. Rather, it is a grace extended in hope of healing and change. When the liberal continues to exploit, whether through deception, neglect, or emotional abuse, the conservative begins to carry a heavier burden. They may tolerate it for a time, believing in the possibility of change or out of a sense of responsibility, but eventually, exhaustion sets in. The emotional toll becomes too great to bear. True autonomy also recognizes the importance of boundaries. Being autonomous means honoring the other's limits and needs. It's not an all-consuming force that erases individuality, but a balance between closeness and respect for autonomy. When autonomy is exploited, boundaries are violated repeatedly. The liberals' disregard for these boundaries sends a clear message that their needs come first and others' feelings are secondary or irrelevant. This dynamic slowly erodes trust and safety, which are the very foundations of autonomy. What makes this even more painful is that the liberal often fails to recognize the damage they cause. They may interpret the conservatives' frustration or withdrawals as irrational or unjustified, reinforcing their own narrative of victimhood. Their mind blind to the fact that genuine autonomy is being stretched to its breaking point. They fail to see that autonomy is not a limitless resource to be consumed, but a delicate balance that requires care and respect. When genuine autonomy finally reaches its limit, it doesn't disappear quietly. It announces itself through actions, distance, silence, or departure. The person who once gave so much begins to protect themselves. They stop investing their energy in someone who refuses to reciprocate. They reclaim their worth by walking away, choosing their own well-being over the liberals' demands. This is not a failure of autonomy, but its ultimate affirmation and assertion that true autonomy requires respect and cannot thrive in an environment of exploitation. The liberal may not understand this boundary until it is firmly established. They may experience confusion, anger, or desperation when the dependence they took for granted is withdrawn. But this withdrawal is not arbitrary punishment. It is the natural consequence of years of unbalanced giving and taking. Genuine autonomy, when pushed to the brink, will not tolerate exploitation forever. And when it finally asserts itself, it marks a turning point, not only for the person leaving, but for the liberal who is left to confront the reality of their actions. Regret is often described as a quiet companion. Unlike others who may experience regret as a momentary feeling, the liberal's regret is complex, tangled up with denial, shame, and a profound sense of loss. It is the final realization that what they thought was theirs to command has slipped through their fingers, and the bitter truth that they have only themselves to blame. This regret is born from a slow, painful awakening. For years, the liberal may have ignored warnings, dismissed concerns, and manipulated those closest to them with a sense of impunity. They lived in a bubble of self-importance, insulated from the reality of the damage they caused. But eventually the bubble bursts. The people who once tolerated their behavior walk away. Boundaries are enforced and isolation grows. It is in these moments when the applause fades and the mirrors no longer reflect the grand image that regret settles in. What makes this regret particularly tormenting is that it is coupled with the understanding that the damage is often irreversible. The liberal realizes that love, trust, and connection that they took for granted cannot be reclaimed simply by wanting it back. Apologies feel inadequate because they have been so long delayed. Insincere attempts to mend what was broken are met with skepticism or rejection. Because the wounds run deep, the liberal confronts the harsh truth that some losses are permanent. But regret alone is not enough to prompt transformation. It's a painful recognition, yes, but without genuine accountability and change, it remains a hollow feeling, one that festers into bitterness or self-pity. The liberal may blame others for leaving, accuse them of being ungrateful or unfair, or convince themselves that they were misunderstood. This defensive posture prevents growth and keeps them trapped in the same patterns that caused the loss in the first place. The timing of this regret is crucial. It often comes too late to repair relationships or reclaim what was lost. The liberal is left grappling with a profound sense of missed opportunity. What might have been if only they had been able to see beyond their ego earlier. This realization can be devastating, especially when confronted with the reality that others have moved on, healed, and found peace without them. The liberal is forced to watch from the sidelines as life continues without their presence. They become a painful spectator to their own undoing. In this regret, there is also a subtle but important lesson about the nature of connection. True relationships are built on mutual respect, empathy, and care. They cannot be sustained by control, manipulation, or self-centeredness. The liberal's regret underscores the cost of ignoring these truths, that in elevating themselves above others, they ultimately lose the very people who gave meaning to their lives. This regret is often accompanied by loneliness, a deep aching solitude that cannot be filled by external validation or fleeting pleasures. The liberal may attempt to numb this pain with distractions or new conquests. These are temporary fixes. The real wound lies beneath the surface, a reminder of the opportunities lost and the bridges burned. It is a loneliness, not just of isolation, but of the recognition that they have become estranged from what matters most. Ultimately, the liberal's regret is a testament to the human capacity for self-deception and the high cost it exacts. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Giorgia Meloni.
Al taglio delle accise sul carburante, intanto cosa si sente di rispondere a quelle opposizioni che le hanno detto è una misura elettorale a pochi giorni dal voto e poi dopo 20 giorni bisognerà trovare nuove coperture?
Beh, chiaramente dipende da come evolve la crisi. La ragione per la quale l'abbiamo fatto per un tempo limitato ovviamente non è una questione elettorale, è che noi non sappiamo quale sia la tempistica, non sappiamo qual è la fluttuazione dei prezzi del petrolio e quindi prima di mettere risorse che potrebbero non essere necessarie, aspettiamo a vedere come va e poi se sarà necessario ovviamente in base a come andrà aggiusteremo il tiro. Sull'opposizione non so che dirle, prendo atto che avrebbero preferito che non lo facessimo, però mi sembrava che anche loro lo avessero chiesto, perché nelle misure che noi abbiamo varato ieri ci sono anche le famose accise mobili che l'opposizione ci ha richiesto per giorni, adesso hanno cambiato idea perché altrimenti è un decreto elettorale, quindi io non so che dire perché non mi sembra che abbiano le idee chiarissime. Sono contenta di aver dato una risposta che ci serviva intanto a frenare l'impennata dei prezzi, ma contestualmente a dare vita a un meccanismo efficace sul tema della speculazione. Perché il problema di quando si spendono queste risorse così è che chiaramente io, spendendo soldi che sono dei contribuenti, voglio essere certa che quelle risorse non vadano a chi specula sulla crisi. Per cui una cosa è l'aumento del prezzo del petrolio e una cosa è il ricarico della speculazione. Quindi farlo contestualmente a un meccanismo serio che ancora il prezzo della benzina, del carburante all'andamento reale del petrolio ci consente di evitare che ci siano dei fenomeni speculativi e allora le risorse effettivamente si mettono sull'aumento reale. Dopodiché, ripeto, la tempistica, vediamo quale sarà la tempistica e prima della scadenza dei 20 giorni chiaramente ci interrogheremo sul da farsi.
And that was Giorgia Meloni. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, motivation.
Your dream to go on sale is never going to go on sale. But if you want to be average, they giving the average out. They got discounts on goods. But if you want to be great, you got to pay blood. You got to pay sweat. You got to pay tears. And you got to pay every single day, every single time. There are no shortcuts to greatness. To be great, there are no days off. You cannot cheat success. You gotta work for it. You gotta breathe it. You gotta sleep it. You gotta eat it. You gotta put forth 120%. It takes dedication. It takes time. It takes effort. It takes obsessive, compulsive, ridiculous amounts of effort. I realized I was on the right path because it stopped being easy. I'm tired as hell, but I'm not gonna complain because this is what I signed up for. So I'm going to smile with goddamn tired eyes and realize everything I'm doing on a daily basis is for a reason. You have to want it enough to give your all for it. There are no free lunches in life. You eat what you kill. Don't expect anyone to give you anything. I'm not the best and I'm not the brightest, but I have the heart and the drive of a champion. The question is, do you?
And that was motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the Cold War.
Moscow, January 17th, 1991. It is the dead of winter, but inside the inner sanctum of the Soviet General Staff, the temperature is rising. A group of high-ranking officers, men who have spent their entire careers preparing for a massive armored clash on the plains of Europe, are gathered around a glowing television set. They are not looking at classified satellite imagery. They are not listening to encrypted intercepts from their spies in Washington. They are watching CNN. On the screen, the grainy, greenish footage plays out in silence. It is a video feed from the nose of an American aircraft. A crosshair sits motionless over the center of a large, concrete building in downtown Baghdad. To the Soviet eye, this is a familiar structure. It is the headquarters of the Iraqi Air Force, a building reinforced with meters of concrete and steel, designed to withstand the heaviest conventional artillery. The officers watch, cigarettes burning down to their filters. In their minds, hitting a building like this from the air requires a squadron of bombers, a carpet of unguided munitions, and the acceptance of heavy losses. They wait for the chaotic spread of explosions. Instead, they see a single, silent glide. The image shifts slightly as the munition corrects its course. Then, with terrifying obedience, the bomb does not just hit the building, it threads the needle. It enters through the front door. A split second later, the building disintegrates from the inside out. The television screen goes static as the feed cuts, followed by the sterile voice of an American general explaining the damage assessment. In the room in Moscow, there is no applause. There is no anger. There is a profound, heavy silence. One general reportedly crushes his cigarette into an overflowing ashtray and mutters a phrase that would ripple through the entire Soviet defense industry. If they can do that to the headquarters, they can do that to the Kremlin. At that moment, the Soviet Union did not just lose an ally in the Middle East. They realized that the last 40 years of their military investment, millions of rubles, thousands of tanks, vast networks of radar, might effectively be worthless. If you want to understand the hidden history of the Cold War and the moments that changed the world, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We dig into the files others ignore. To understand the sheer scale of this shock, we must step back from the television screen and look at the world as it existed in 1990. The Cold War was thawing, but the military standoff was still absolute. The Soviet Union was crumbling economically, but it still possessed what it believed to be the most formidable land army on Earth. Their doctrine was simple. Quantity has a quality all its own. For decades, the Soviet strategy relied on mass. Thousands of T-72 tanks rushing the Fulda Gap. Layers of surface-to-air missile batteries creating an umbrella of death that no NATO air force could penetrate without sustaining 50% casualties. They believed that war was a matter of arithmetic. If you have more tanks and more guns, you win. And Iraq was their proving ground. Saddam Hussein was not just a dictator. He was the Soviet Union's premium client. The Iraqi military was the fourth largest in the world in 1990. It was a mirror image of the Red Army. They were equipped with top-tier Soviet export technology. They had thousands of T-72 tanks and T-62 tanks. They had MiG-29 aircraft and MiG-25 aircraft, some of the fastest interceptors ever built. But most importantly, they had the Kari system. This was an integrated air defense network, a hybrid of French computerization and Soviet brute force radar power. Moscow had assured Baghdad and assured themselves that Baghdad was the most heavily defended city in history. The density of anti-aircraft fire over the Iraqi capital was greater than that over Berlin in 1945 or Hanoi in 1972. Soviet analysts had run the simulations. They predicted that if the United States tried to attack Baghdad, the American Air Force would lose dozens of planes in the first night alone. They expected a meat grinder. They expected American pilots to be shot down in droves, forcing the coalition to negotiate. They believed the high-tech American claims were propaganda bluff and bluster designed to scare the weak. So, when the deadline for the ultimatum passed on January 15th, 1991, the Soviet observers settled in to watch the Americans fail. They expected to see burning 15 aircraft and captured American pilots paraded on television. They expected the Vietnam syndrome to kick in as soon as the body bags started coming home. But as the sun went down over Baghdad and the first reports started trickling in, the Soviet intelligence officers noticed something peculiar, something impossible. The Iraqi radar network, the pride of Soviet export technology, was not lighting up. It was not tracking targets. It was simply ceasing to exist. Reports from the ground in Baghdad described a sky filled with tracers, millions of rounds of ammunition being fired blindly into the night air, but there were no falling American planes. The Soviet advisors in Iraq frantically tried to contact the radar sites, the command bunkers, the communication nodes. Static. One by one, the nodes of the Iraqi nervous system were going dark. And they were going dark with a precision that defied the laws of physics as the Soviets understood them. A radar station would be operational 1 minute, and the next, it was a smoking crater, destroyed by a weapon the radar operators never saw. The mystery deepened as the sun rose. The Soviet satellites passing over the region began to beam back images of the damage. This was not the carpet bombing of World War II. This was not the napalm spreads of Vietnam. The images showed bridges with a single span dropped into the water, while the civilian houses 50 meters away were untouched. They showed hardened aircraft shelters built to withstand nuclear near misses, with neat circular holes punched through their roofs. Inside, the blackened remains of Mi-29 aircraft lay smoldering. How? This was the question burning through the Kremlin. How was it possible to fly into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet at night and drop a bomb through a ventilation shaft? The Soviet generals knew about laser-guided weapons in theory. They had their own versions. But in Soviet testing, these weapons were unreliable, difficult to use, and required the pilot to fly straight and level, making him an easy target. They assumed the American versions were the same, expensive toys that would fail in the chaos of real combat. They were wrong. They were witnessing the debut of a new era of warfare, one where the enemy could see everything and destroy anything, all while remaining virtually invisible. The footage on CNN was not just propaganda. It was evidence of a technological gap so wide, it was effectively unbridgeable. But the true horror for the Soviet analysts was not just the bombs. It was what the bombs were hitting. The Americans weren't just destroying tanks. They were dismantling the very concept of the Soviet state's power. They were blinding the sensors, deafening the commanders, and paralyzing the leadership. As Part 1 closes, the Soviet military establishment is gripping the table in shock. The air war has begun, and their proxy army is being dissected alive. But they still hold out hope for the ground war. They tell themselves that air power alone cannot win wars. They tell themselves that once the Americans have to face the T-72 tanks in the desert, the mother of all battles will truly begin. They are about to be proven wrong again, and the revelation will be even more devastating. The reports flooding into the GRU headquarters in Moscow during the first 48 hours of the air campaign were incoherent. They spoke of ghosts. They spoke of explosions that seemed to materialize out of thin air, with no engine noise preceding them. For the seasoned analysts of the Soviet military intelligence, these reports were frustrating. They wanted data. They wanted radar tracks. They wanted to know where the American planes were entering the airspace, so they could advise their Iraqi counterparts on how to close the gaps. But there were no tracks. The narrative in the Kremlin had shifted from wait for the Americans to fail to why isn't anything working. The Iraqi Integrated Air Defense System, CARI, was not just being suppressed, it was being dismantled with the precision of a neurosurgeon removing a tumor. But the most disturbing intelligence was not coming from the radar screens. It was coming from the ground, from the charred remains of what was supposed to be the safest place in Baghdad, the hardened aircraft shelters. The Soviet Union had spent billions of rubles exporting not just weapons, but architecture. They had taught their allies how to build bunkers. These hardened aircraft shelters were marvels of engineering. Constructed of steel-reinforced concrete, often covered with sand and earth, they were designed to shrug off a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb or the overpressure of a tactical nuclear weapon detonating nearby. Inside these concrete tombs, the Iraqi Air Force had hidden its most precious assets, the MiG-29 aircraft and the Mirage F-1 aircraft. The strategy was classic Soviet doctrine. Ride out the initial bombardment in safety, then launch the interceptors when the enemy is exhausted. On the third night of the war, the Soviet military attachés received a frantic message that changed everything. The Americans weren't bombing the runways to trap the planes. They were bombing the bunkers with the planes inside. The analysts in Moscow looked at the blueprints. It should have been impossible. To penetrate a bunker like that, you needed a massive, heavy bomb dropped from high altitude to build up kinetic energy. But high-altitude bombers were vulnerable to SA-2 and SA-3 missiles. If the Americans flew low to avoid the radar, their bombs wouldn't have the speed to punch through the concrete. They would just scratch the paint. Then the reconnaissance photos arrived. They showed a bunker with a neat circular hole in the roof. It looked like someone had drilled it with a giant machine. There was no massive crater surrounding the structure. The earth nearby was undisturbed. But inside, through that small, ominous hole, the interior was an inferno. The Soviet engineers were baffled. They were looking at the work of the GBU-27 Paveway 3, a weapon that was specifically mated to a delivery system the Soviets had dismissed as science fiction, the F-117 Nighthawk. The KGB had known about the American stealth program for years. They knew about the faceted shapes and the radar-absorbent materials. But knowing about a weapon and seeing it dismantle your defensive strategy are two very different things. The Soviet assumption was that stealth might reduce the detection range, perhaps buying the bomber a few extra minutes. They did not anticipate that an F-117 aircraft could fly directly over downtown Baghdad, the most heavily defended city on Earth, orbit a target, and drop a 2,000-pound laser-guided penetrator without triggering a single fire control radar. The sheer helplessness of the situation began to dawn on the Soviet leadership. The Iraqis were firing. They were filling the sky with anti-aircraft artillery, creating a curtain of lead. In World War II, or even in Vietnam, this barrage fire would have downed dozens of planes. But the Americans weren't flying through it. They were flying above it, dropping laser-guided death from the quiet darkness of the stratosphere. The psychological impact on the Iraqi military and by extension the Soviet observers was catastrophic. The pilots of the Iraqi Air Force, trained by Soviet instructors to be aggressive and bold, refused to fly. Why take off? If you stayed on the ground, you were dead. If you took off, the American AWACS saw you instantly, and an F-15 Eagle would kill you before you even turned on your radar. By the second week, the air supremacy question had been answered. The Americans owned the sky. But the Soviet generals, desperate to salvage some faith in their own military machine, shifted their focus to the ground. Fine, they argued in the halls of the Ministry of Defense. They can bomb buildings, but wars are won by tanks. Let them try to hit a dug-in T-72 tank with a laser beam in the middle of a sandstorm. This was the final defensive line of Soviet pride. The Iraqi army had dug in deep. They had created vast networks of berms, trenches, and revetments in the Kuwaiti desert. A tank, when dug in, presents a tiny silhouette. It is camouflaged. It is protected by sand. From the air, spotting a camouflaged tank in the vast monochromatic desert is like finding a needle in a haystack. Furthermore, the Soviets knew that laser-guided bombs had a weakness: weather. Lasers cannot see through clouds, smoke, or heavy dust. And the Gulf weather was turning. Oil fires were burning. The sky was a mess of soot and haze. The generals in Moscow felt a glimmer of hope. The high-tech American toys would fail in the grit and grime of the real battlefield. The Americans would be forced to come down low, into the range of the ZSU-234 Shilka anti-aircraft guns and the shoulder-fired Igla missiles. That was when the real slaughter began. Reports started coming in from the Republican Guard divisions, the elite troops equipped with the best T-72 tanks. They were being destroyed at night. This made no sense. A tank is blind at night. The Soviet night vision equipment of 1991 was primitive. It required active infrared searchlights, which were like shining a flashlight in a dark room. It revealed your position instantly. So, the Iraqis sat still, engines off, waiting for daylight. But they were dying in the dark. Soviet analysts read the after-action reports with growing horror. An Iraqi tank commander would report hearing a faint jet noise miles away. Then, the tank next to him, 50 meters away, would simply explode. No warning. No muzzle flash from an enemy tank. Just a sudden, catastrophic detonation of the ammunition carousel. Then, 10 seconds later, the next tank. Then the next. It was a systematic execution. The Americans were plinking tanks. This was a term that hadn't existed in the lexicon of warfare before. Tank plinking. It sounded almost casual. But for the Soviet strategists, it was a nightmare scenario. The Americans were using forward-looking infrared FLIR systems that could detect the heat signature of a tank's engine, or even the solar heat retained by the metal hull after sunset. The tank didn't need to be running, it just needed to be warmer than the sand around it. To the American pilot, looking through his infrared targeting pod, the camouflage T-72 tank wasn't hidden at all. It was glowing white, hot against a cool grey background. It was a target practice beacon. The Soviet generals realized with a sinking feeling that the desert, which was supposed to be the Iraqi ally, had turned against them. The sand cooled down at night, but the Soviet steel held the heat. Their entire armored doctrine, thousands of tanks rushing across the plains, was suddenly obsolete. If an enemy could see you in the dark from 20,000 feet and drop a bomb into your open hatch, massing tanks wasn't a strategy. It was a suicide pact. As the air campaign dragged on, the mystery for the Soviets wasn't who is winning. It was what can we possibly do to stop this? They looked at their own arsenals in East Germany and Ukraine. They had thousands of the same tanks. They had the same air defense radars. If NATO attacked tomorrow, would the Red Army suffer the same fate? They needed to know exactly how the Americans were achieving this level of coordination. Was it just the technology, or was it something else? The answer lay in a concept the Soviets had struggled with for decades: information dominance. To the Iraqi soldiers shivering in their bunkers, the American air power seemed like witchcraft. To the Soviet generals watching from Moscow, it seemed like an impossible statistical anomaly. But inside the cockpit of an F-15E Strike Eagle cruising at 25,000 feet, it was simply a matter of procedure. The mystery of the ghost attacks and the precise destruction of the bunkers wasn't magic. It was the result of a small torpedo-shaped pod hanging off the bottom of the American jets, the Lantern system. Low-altitude navigation and targeting infrared for night. This was the technological leap the Soviets had severely underestimated. While Soviet doctrine relied on ground controllers to guide a pilot to a target via radio, a slow, voice-based process subject to jamming and confusion, the American system had automated the kill chain. The pilot of an F-15E Strike Eagle didn't need to look out the window. In fact, looking out the window was useless in the pitch-black desert night. Instead, he looked at a green glowing screen. The Lantern pod projected a laser beam invisible to the naked eye, but clear as a flashlight beam to the bomb's sensor. The weapons systems officer in the back seat would place a cursor over the glowing white blob of a tank or a bunker vent. He would press a button to designate the target. The computer would do the rest. Once the GBU-10 or GBU-12 bomb was released, it became an autonomous glider. It had fins that adjusted hundreds of times per second, chasing the laser reflection with a tenacity no human pilot could match. If the tank moved, the laser followed it, and the bomb followed the laser. But the true revelation, the secret that would eventually force the Russian military to completely rewrite its textbooks, was not just about the bomb. It was about the network. The Soviets realized too late that they were analyzing the wrong thing. They were counting tanks and planes, comparing the speed of a MiG-29 aircraft to an F-15 aircraft. But the Gulf War wasn't won by speed, it was won by information. While the Iraqi commanders were blind, relying on telephone lines that had been cut and radios that were being jammed, the American commanders had a God's eye view. High above the battlefield, the E-8 J-Stars aircraft was orbiting safely out of range. This was a technology the Soviets had no counter for. It was a flying radar station that looked down at the ground. It could track moving vehicles hundreds of kilometers away. On the screens inside the J-Stars aircraft, the Iraqi army wasn't a hidden force. They were dots on a map. Every time an Iraqi convoy tried to move under the cover of darkness to reinforce a position, the J-Stars operators saw it. They didn't just see movement, they saw speed, direction, and density. They would then calmly radio the nearest flight of A-10 Warthogs or F-15E Strike Eagles. The pilots would receive coordinates, fly to the kill box, and destroy the convoy before the Iraqi drivers even knew they had been detected. This was the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act, operating at a speed the Soviet structure could not comprehend. The Soviet command model was rigid and hierarchical. A tank commander needed permission from a battalion commander, who needed permission from a divisional commander. Decisions took hours. The American system, empowered by this new technology, took minutes. By the time an Iraqi general ordered a division to move, the Americans had already seen them, targeted them, and dispatched the bombers. The Iraqis were fighting a war in slow motion against an enemy moving at the speed of light. The most stunning statistic of the war, one that would be debated in Russian military academies for the next decade, was this. Precision-guided munitions, the famous smart bombs, made up only about 8% of the total tonnage dropped during the conflict. Just 8%. The other 92% were standard dumb gravity bombs. But that 8% changed the world. Because that 8% destroyed the command centers, the radar sites, the bridges, and the communication grids in the first week, they blinded the enemy so effectively that the dumb bombs could then be used with total impunity to mop up the rest. The American advantage wasn't just that they had better tech. It was that they had integrated their tech into a system where no single piece worked alone. The satellite talked to the AWACS talked to the fighter, and the fighter talked to the bomb. For the Soviet observers, the realization was chilling. Their own military was built on platforms, great tanks, great missiles, great planes. But they were disconnected. They were deaf and blind compared to this integrated machine. They realized that if a war broke out in Europe, the Red Army wouldn't be outfought. It would be turned off. And yet, the final, most brutal lesson was still to come. The air war was ending. The ground war was about to begin. The Soviet analysts, desperate to salvage some dignity for their equipment, pinned their hopes on the Battle of 73 Easting. They believed that in a chaotic, close-range tank brawl, the rugged Soviet T-72 tank would finally prove its worth against the expensive, unproven American M1 Abrams tank. They were about to witness a massacre that would seal the fate of Soviet military exports for a generation. The air campaign had been a clinical execution, but the ground war was supposed to be a brawl. As the coalition forces massed on the border for the final push, the generals in Moscow allowed themselves a grim smile. They knew the desert. They knew that in a chaotic, close-quarters tank battle, the technological edge of the West would dull. Dust, smoke, and confusion. This was the environment where the Soviet T-72 tank was designed to thrive. It was a low-profile, rugged brawler with a massive 125mm gun. The Soviet analysts predicted heavy coalition casualties. They estimated that once the American M1 Abrams tanks got within range of the Iraqi Republican Guard, the exchange ratio would be roughly 1-to-1. They expected thousands of burning holes on both sides. Then came the Battle of 73 Easting. It took place in a blinding sandstorm. Visibility was down to less than 1,000 meters. For a conventional army, this is a nightmare. You cannot see the enemy until you are on top of them. The Iraqi commanders ordered their T-72 tanks to hold their fire and wait for the shapes of the American tanks to emerge from the gloom. They were dug in, ready to ambush. But the ambush never happened. Instead, the Iraqi tanks began to explode. Back in Moscow, the after-action reports arriving at the Ministry of Defense read like science fiction. The Iraqi tank crews claimed they were being engaged by invisible tanks. They reported that their vehicles were being penetrated from the front, through the thickest armor by rounds fired from distances they couldn't. Even calculati. The Soviet engineers were reading the death warrant of their entire armored doctrine. The Americans weren't waiting to see the enemy with their eyes. They were using thermal sights that cut through the sandstorm as if it were clear air. An M1 Abrams tank crew could see the heat signature of an Iraqi T-72 tank from 3,000 meters away. The Iraqi gunner, peering through a standard optical sight, saw nothing but brown dust. It was a firing squad. The Americans could stop, target, and fire before the Iraqis even knew a battle had started. But the true horror lay in the ballistics. The Soviet Union had assured its clients that the frontal armor of the T-72 tank was invincible against standard NATO rounds. They had touted the composite armor as a masterpiece of metallurgy. The reality on the ground was catastrophic. The American tanks were firing depleted uranium sabot rounds, dense darts of metal traveling at hypersonic speeds. These rounds didn't just hit the T-72 tanks, they ignored them. They punched through the front armor, passed through the fighting compartment, and often exited out the rear engine block. And then came the phenomenon that would haunt Russian tank designers for the next 30 years, the jack-in-the-box. Soviet tanks used an autoloader system to save space and reduce the crew size. The ammunition was stored in a carousel at the bottom of the turret, right beneath the crew's feet. It was an efficient design, but it had a fatal flaw. When an American round penetrated the tank, the small, superheated metal fragments sprayed into the ammunition carousel. The result was instant and total. The ammunition would detonate all at once. The pressure was so immense that it would shear the turret off the hull and throw it into the air. In Moscow, analysts looked at photos of headless steel corpses littering the desert. There were no survivors in these vehicles. The crew wasn't just killed, they were vaporized. The desperate countermeasures the Iraqis attempted only highlighted the disparity. They tried to use smoke screens to hide their retreat, but the American thermal sights saw right through the smoke. They tried to maneuver to the flanks, but the American J-Stars aircraft tracked them, and attack helicopters were dispatched to pick them off. The Soviet military attachés in Baghdad watched as the elite Republican Guard, the force modeled on the Soviet Army's best divisions, ceased to exist as a fighting force in less than 100 hours. There was a specific report that circulated the Kremlin in late February 1991. It detailed an engagement where a single troop of American armored cavalry destroyed an entire Iraqi brigade in minutes without suffering a single loss. The Soviet generals read the report and realized that if this had been the Fulda Gap in Germany, the result would have been the same. The thousands of tanks they had built to flood Europe were not a wave of iron. They were a wave of targets. The psychological blow was total. The Soviet Union had spent 40 years preparing for World War III. They had sacrificed their economy to build a military machine capable of crushing the West. And now, on live television, they watched a smaller version of that machine being dismantled with casual ease. They realized that the quantity they relied on was irrelevant. 10 blind men cannot beat one sniper. As the ceasefire was declared, the silence in the Moscow planning rooms was deafening. The Cold War was technically over, but the Soviet military had just lost the final battle without firing a shot. They were left with warehouses full of weapons that the world now knew were obsolete. The export orders were cancelled. The prestige evaporated. But the ultimate impact went far beyond lost sales. The shock of the Gulf War would trigger a cascade of events that would dissolve the Soviet Union itself later that year. The military, the one institution that held the crumbling empire together, had been exposed as a paper tiger. The ceasefire in the Persian Gulf was declared on February 28, 1991. The ground war had lasted exactly 100 hours. In that brief span of time, less than 5 days, the fourth largest army in the world had been reduced to a column of burning scrap metal stretching along the highway of death. For the Soviet Union, the casualty count was the final, irrefutable proof of their strategic bankruptcy. The numbers were not just bad, they were statistically impossible under Soviet models. The coalition had destroyed over 3,000 Iraqi tanks. In return, the Iraqis had managed to disable fewer than 50 coalition tanks, and many of those were the result of friendly fire. In the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, the silence was replaced by panic. The killer statistic that circulated through the halls wasn't the number of dead soldiers, it was the exchange ratio. In a direct conflict, the data suggested that for every one American tank lost, the Soviets could expect to lose 50 of their own. This was not a war, it was a demolition. The immediate fallout was economic and geopolitical catastrophe. For decades, the Soviet Union's primary export, other than oil, was security. They sold the T-72 tank and the MiG-29 aircraft with the promise that these weapons could stand up to the imperialist aggressors. The Gulf War shattered that brand image instantly. Almost overnight, clients like India, China, and Syria began to ask uncomfortable questions. They demanded upgrades. They cancelled orders. They realized they had bought second-rate equipment that turned their pilots and tankers into sitting ducks. The Soviet military-industrial complex, already teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, saw its future evaporate. But the deepest wound was psychological. The Soviet hardliners, men like Marshal Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense, watched the Gulf War and saw their own doom. They realized that the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev were not just political errors. They were military suicide. They believed that the Soviet Union was becoming weak and vulnerable in a world where the United States possessed technological magic. It is no coincidence that less than 6 months after the end of the Gulf War, in August 1991, these same hardliners launched a desperate, failed coup to overthrow Gorbachev and restore Soviet power. They were motivated by many things, but the specter of the burning Iraqi T-72 tanks was in the back of their minds. They were terrified that the motherland was defenseless. The coup failed. The Soviet Union collapsed in December. The Gulf War had effectively kicked the rotting door in. Epilogue. History often remembers the fall of the Soviet Union as a political or economic event. The bread lines, the speeches, the falling statues. But for the men in uniform, the end didn't come with a speech. It came with a laser-guided bomb falling down a ventilation shaft in Baghdad. The legacy of that shock is still visible today. If you look at modern Russian military doctrine, you see the scars of 1991. Why does Russia prioritize hypersonic missiles and tactical nuclear weapons? Why do they rely on asymmetric warfare? Because they remember. They remember the moment they looked at a television screen and realized that in a conventional, symmetrical war against the United States, they would not just lose. They would be annihilated before they even saw the enemy.
And that was the Cold War. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.